Welcome to the Deep Dive. Here, we take complex topics, dig into the sources, articles, research notes, and basically pull out the key insights for you.
The idea is to give you that clear understanding, maybe spark a few aha moments without you having to wade through everything yourself.
Exactly. And today, this deep dive is really for you, the learner, if you're curious about big issues, want clarity, but maybe feel a bit overwhelmed by all the noise sometimes.
So today's focus, African migration to France. We're looking at the history, the lasting impact, and especially the challenges around integration generation after generation.
Right, particularly for Franco-Africans. And we'll bring in a comparison, too, looking at Austria and its Turkish origin communities.
Yeah, our main sources are a paper on the experience of Franco-African communities in metropolitan France, and another comparing integration in France and Austria, specifically the third generation.
So one gives us that ground level view, the other a policy comparison.
That's the plan.
Okay, so our mission here is to unpack the roots of this migration, figure out what's made integration tricky, understand what life is like for that third generation French citizens, but maybe not feeling fully integrated, and see what we can learn from comparing France and Austria.
Sounds good.
Right, let's dive in. Where does this significant migration to France really start? What are the origins?
Well, you really have to go back to France's colonial history. That's the bedrock. But things really ramped up after World War II with labor recruitment.
Labor recruitment.
Yeah, France actively needed workers for reconstruction, for its booming economy. So they looked to the colonies and former colonies, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, then places like Senegal, Mali too.
Ah, okay. So that colonial connection provided the pathway and the economy pulled them in.
Precisely. And those early dynamics, they cast a long shadow, influencing integration right up to today.
Can you give us a feel for the numbers back then, early on?
Sure. Take Algerians, for example. By 1954, which is when the Algerian War kicked off, there were already about 200,000 Algerian immigrants in France.
Okay, 200,000.
But by the 1960s, that number had exploded. Estimates range from 400,000 to maybe even 700,000.
Wow, that's a huge increase in just a decade or so. Was it all about jobs, the economic pull?
Mostly, yes. The French economy was strong. Wages were higher. That was a big draw. But you can't ignore the push factors either.
Meaning?
Well, think about what was happening back in the colonies. Decolonization struggles, conflict. The Algerian War of Independence was particularly brutal. That pushed a lot of people out.
So instability and violence at home were also driving forces.
Absolutely. And interestingly, during the Algerian War itself, migration to France actually increased. The Algerian population there went from about 211,000 in 54 to 350,000 by 62.
Even with the war going on.
Yes, partly because of the violence and displacement within Algeria caused by the French military, but also fear of reprisals, especially for Harkist Algerians who sided with the French. For many, France became a refuge, ironically.
Right, escaping the conflict zone. What about migrants from sub-Saharan Africa? Was their journey similar?
Initially, it was a bit different. For many from the Sahel region, say, the idea was often temporary. Go to France, earn money, send it home.
More like guest workers.
Kind of, yeah. But then, sub-Saharan countries gained independence around 1960, and French policy shifted towards allowing family reunification. So more people started settling permanently.
Ah, okay. So the temporary plan became permanent for many.
Exactly. By the mid-70s, African immigrants, especially from the Maghreb, were a really significant part of France's foreign-born population. It evolved from labor flow to demographic change.
Okay, so they arrived, often fleeing difficult situations or seeking work. What was life actually like for them in France? The practicalities work, housing, must have been tough.
Oh, exceptionally challenging. The first generation mostly ended up in low-paying, physically demanding jobs. The kind of jobs French foreign workers often didn't want anymore.
Like what kind of work?
Manual labor, basically. Auto factories, construction, mining, domestic service. Grueling work. Many just put up with it, thinking, it's temporary, save money, go back.
And housing. Finding a place to live.
That was a massive hurdle. Discrimination was widespread, and there just wasn't enough decent housing. This led to really segregated living conditions.
How segregated?
In the 50s and into the mid-60s, thousands upon thousands, mainly North and West Africans, ended up in what they called bidonvilles.
Bidonvilles, what are those exactly?
Basically shanty towns. Informal settlements on the edges of big cities.
So makeshift housing.
Yeah, built from scrap materials, no running water, no proper sanitation, no heating, overcrowded, unhealthy. It's estimated that in 1963, something like 43% of Algerians in France live like this.
43%, that's staggering.
It is. Around Paris alone, There were nearly 100 of these settlements. It really shows an early failure by the authorities to cope, to provide adequate conditions.
Living like that must have forced people together, though, building community out of necessity.
It definitely fostered strong social bonds, yes. People relied on each other, set up informal support networks. Shared experience created solidarity.
So what happened to the bidonvilles?
Eventually, starting around the 70s, the government began clearing them and relocating people. They moved them into newly built social housing, the HLMs, mostly in the suburbs, the banlieues.
HLMs, low-rent housing blocks, so an improvement.
In terms of physical conditions, absolutely. Proper walls, running water, heating.
Yeah.
A big step up from the bidonville.
I sense a but coming.
But the way they were planned created new problems. These estates were often built far out, geographically isolated.
On the outskirts.
Yeah. And as more established residents, often white French families, moved out over time, these HLMs became increasingly concentrated with immigrant families.
Ah, so replacing one kind of segregation with another. Spatial segregation.
Pretty much. Concentrated poverty, limited opportunities, lack of social mix. It was a critical mistake in urban planning, looking back. A lack of foresight.
And within these new banlieue communities, how did people maintain their culture, their connections?
Well, they started building their own infrastructure. Halal butchers started appearing, grocery shops selling food from back home, cafes where workers gathered.
Community hubs.
Exactly. And religious and cultural associations formed, early mosques were established, advocacy groups popped up too, fighting for rights.
And the next generation, the children growing up there.
Right, the second generation, often called the Boers back then. By the early 80s, they were starting to assert their own identity, a kind of Franco-African identity. The 1983 March for Equality Against Racism was a key moment for them.
So a new generation finding its voice.
Yeah. Well, the first generation often navigated this dual life, connected to home, but living and working in France, becoming part of the French working class in these specific suburban spaces.
Okay, let's fast forward now. We're talking about the third generation, the grandchildren of those first migrants. The sources talk about a contemporary integration crisis. What does that look like?
It's marked by several persistent problems. One is that spatial segregation we talked about continues in many disadvantaged banlieues. Another is unequal access to good public services. And crucially, ongoing systemic discrimination.
Systemic discrimination.
Yes, baked into the system in various ways. So despite being born French, raised French, many in this third generation still feel marginalized. It points to a real failure in France's integration model to fully include them.
Let's break that down. The spatial segregation, how did these banlieues become so entrenched as places of disadvantage?
It goes back to that post-war planning, concentrating social housing on the periphery. Then add factors like, well, white flight, discriminatory housing practices. It created these large suburban areas with high minority populations and very little economic dynamism.
And these are the areas now called QPVs, priority neighborhoods.
Exactly. Quartier prioritaire de la politique de la ville. Even a former prime minister, Manuel Valls, described it pretty bluntly as territorial, social, ethnic apartheid.
Strong words. How does this concentration impact daily life for the third generation?
It impacts almost everything. Take schools. Often fewer resources, maybe fewer daycare spots, like 6 times lower than average in some places. Teachers might be less experienced.
So educational outcomes suffer.
Often, yes. Higher dropout rates are reported. One study mentioned 1 in 6 leaving without a diploma in these areas. Then there's transport.
Isolation.
Big time. Yeah. Many banlieues were built without good links to city centers or job markets. Clichy-sous-Bois famously didn't have a proper train or metro connection to Paris for decades. It makes getting to work, to better schools, just harder.
Reinforces the exclusion.
Totally.
Yeah.
And it doesn't stop there. Healthcare access can be worse. They talk about medical deserts with fewer doctors, fewer specialists.
And jobs within the banlieues.
Often scarce. Local economies are weak. Unemployment rates are persistently high, double, sometimes triple the national average. For young people, it can be astronomical, 30–40%, even higher in some places like Clichy-sous-Bois a few years back. It's a real vicious cycle.
Beyond these structural issues, you mentioned systemic discrimination. Where does that hit hardest?
It's felt across the board, but particularly in education, getting a job, and interactions with the police.
How in education?
Well, reports suggest things like lower teacher expectations for kids from these backgrounds, being pushed more towards vocational tracks rather than academic ones, maybe facing disciplinary action more often.
And getting a job, even if you overcome the educational hurdles.
This is a huge point of frustration. There's significant evidence of hiring discrimination. Just having an African-sounding name or an address in a known banlieue can mean your CV gets ignored.
Seriously, even with the same qualifications.
Yes, audits by groups like SOS Racism and even government studies have shown this repeatedly. Identical CVs, different names, vastly different callback rates. Unemployment for North African university graduates, for example, has been reported at something like 26% compared to 5% for French origin grads.
That's incredibly stark. It undermines the whole idea of meritocracy.
It absolutely does, and it breeds resentment. Then there's the policing issue.
What about policing?
This is a major source of tension. Residents in these areas, particularly young men perceived as Black or North African, report being stopped and checked by police far more often.
Is there data on that?
Yes. France's own defender of rights found young men perceived as Black or North African were 20 times more likely to be stopped. 20 times.
Wow.
And these stops are often described as aggressive, disrespectful. It creates this feeling of being constantly under suspicion, of being second-class citizens.
And that can escalate tragically.
It can. The deaths of two teenagers fleeing police in Clichy-sous-Bois in 2005, which sparked massive riots across France, really highlighted this deep sense of injustice and the lack of accountability sometimes. It points to a failure of the state to ensure equal treatment for everyone.
So putting it all together, the segregation, the lack of resources, the discrimination, well, what are the overall consequences?
Yeah.
How does this integration crisis manifest?
You see it in higher poverty rates in these neighborhoods. QPVs average around 40% poverty versus 14% nationally. You see it in lower educational attainment overall, fewer kids from the banlieues making it to top universities.
And socially.
The social fabric can be strained. Sometimes higher rates of single-parent families, maybe a weaker sense of community cohesion in some spots, and as we've seen, periodic explosions of unrest 2005, more recently in 2023. These are all symptoms of deep-seated marginalization.
Has France tried to fix this? What policies have they put in place?
There have been efforts, yes, but often it feels like swinging between soft approaches and tough security responses.
Soft approaches like
Urban renewal programs, mainly. The Politique de la Ville aims to improve living conditions, services. Jean-Louis Borloo, when he was urban policy minister, pushed for big, comprehensive plans.
the Marshall Plan for the banlieues?
Yeah, that term was used. His ideas were ambitious, tackling housing, transport, education, jobs, discrimination altogether. Things like creating academies for talented youth, education cities, renovating housing, boosting childcare, digital campuses.
Sounds comprehensive. Did it happen?
Some elements were implemented over the years through various urban renewal projects. But Borloo proposed another big push in 2018, estimated to cost around 50 billion euros. President Macron didn't fully endorse it, though.
Ah, so the political will or funding wasn't quite there for that scale of investment.
It seems that way. It highlights the ongoing challenge of prioritizing and adequately funding these deep structural changes.
What about tackling discrimination specifically? Any progress there?
It's been debated a lot. France has this official colorblind Republican ideal, which sometimes makes it hard to even talk about race-based discrimination, let alone target it with policy.
So things like affirmative action are difficult.
Very difficult politically. They've experimented with things like anonymized CVs, but enforcement of existing anti-discrimination laws is often seen as weak.
But there have been legal challenges.
Yes. That 2016 class action suit over police profiling was significant, and a court ruling in 2023 actually acknowledged systemic discrimination in police identity checks. That's a potentially big step.
Acknowledging the problem is one thing.
Exactly. Proposed solutions like giving receipts for police stops, using more body cameras, they're still being debated. It shows the ongoing struggle to really get to grips with this. France's reluctance to fully face up to systemic discrimination has arguably hampered progress.
Okay, it's clear France has faced major hurdles. Let's bring in the comparison now. Austria and its Turkish origin communities. How did their migration story start? Different from France's.
Quite different, yes. Austria didn't have the same colonial relationship. Their migration from Turkey and also Yugoslavia back then was driven almost entirely by post-war labor recruitment agreements.
So less colonial baggage, more purely economic.
Primarily, yes. And importantly, the initial idea in Austria was very much the guest worker model, Gastarbeiter. It was meant to be temporary.
Whereas in France, even if some intended it to be temporary, the colonial links and later family reunification made it more permanent from earlier on.
Right. That difference in initial intent might have shaped how immigration policies developed or didn't develop in the early stages.
Okay, different starting points. How has integration unfolded for the third generation of Turkish origin in Austria? Is it comparable to the French situation?
It's tricky because Austrian stats often define migration background differently. If your parents were born in Austria, you might not count, even if your grandparents were Turkish immigrants.
So the third generation is less statistically visible.
Somewhat, yes. But we know they exist, likely tens of thousands. In terms of social integration, things look a bit different from France in some ways. Language acquisition seems generally better. Many grow up speaking German fluently.
Okay, that's a potential positive difference. What about economically?
Education, jobs. That's where the challenges persist. Similar in outcome, if not always in cause, to France. Turkish origin Austrians still tend to have lower rates of higher education attainment and higher unemployment compared to Austrians without a migration background.
So even with better language integration, perhaps, the socioeconomic gaps remain.
They do. Surveys show many feel Austrian or hold a dual Austrian-Turkish identity, which is interesting. And Austria hasn't seen those massive Van Loo-style riots like France.
But the disadvantage is still there.
Yes. Higher school dropout rates for those speaking Turkish at home, lower progression to university. And studies show significantly lower employment rates and higher unemployment for Turkish origin individuals. So maybe smoother social integration on the surface for some, but socioeconomic parity is definitely still a struggle.
Let's compare the state approaches more directly. Education first. How do France and Austria differ?
France, as we said, pushes for assimilation through a unified system. They even got rid of mother tongue programs. Austria, while it had early tracking, which can be problematic, did later bring in things like German support classes and voluntary mother tongue teaching.
So different philosophies on linguistic diversity.
Right. And ironically, despite France's unified system, its schools show more social segregation than Austria's, though Austria still struggles to ensure equal outcomes for Turkish origin kids. France's focus on assimilation perhaps missed the need for targeted support.
What about housing? We saw how crucial the banlieues were in France.
Big difference here. France created those huge, isolated estates. Austria's settlement patterns tended to be more mixed from the start. They had more of a policy focus on avoiding large ghettos, leveraging their tradition of social housing to try and create mixed communities.
So less spatial concentration of disadvantage in Austria.
Generally speaking, yes, although immigrant clusters certainly exist, but not on the scale or with the same level of isolation as many French banlieues, a more proactive urban planning approach, perhaps.
And the labor market, how do they compare in trying to integrate people into jobs?
Both have anti-discrimination laws on paper. But in France, we see those persistently high employment rates for descendants of immigrants and clear evidence of hiring bias. Austria uses its dual vocational training system and has active programs, but still faces similar problems. Lower employment, higher unemployment for the Turkish origin population, and reports of discrimination too. France's outcomes here, by some measures, are actually below the EU average.
Now, citizenship law. France has ius soli, Austria is sanguinis. That sounds like a fundamental difference.
It really is. Is Seclina right of the soil means if you're born in France, you generally become a citizen automatically. So most third-generation Franco-Africans are French citizens.
In Austria.
Ius sanguinis right of blood means citizenship is primarily based on your parents' nationality. So many third-generation Turkish origin Austrians born and raised there might not be Austrian citizens.
That must affect their sense of belonging, political rights.
Hugely. It impacts voting, for instance. A significant chunk of Austria's population born in Austria doesn't hold Austrian citizenship. France's more inclusive law here likely helps foster a stronger sense of national belonging, even with all the other challenges.
One last comparison point. Religion. France's strict laïcité versus Austria.
Very different approaches. France aims for strict state neutrality, limiting religious expression in public spaces like schools, the headscarf ban being the most obvious example.
In Austria.
Austria has a more cooperative model. It officially recognizes Islam, allows religious education in schools, generally permits headscarves in public life, though they do have a ban on full-face veils.
So Austria engages more directly with religious communities.
It seems so. This likely shapes how Muslims navigate their identity within Austrian society, perhaps differently than in France, where the strict secularism itself can sometimes become a point of friction.
Okay, drawing this all together. Based on this comparison, what are the key takeaways, especially for understanding France's situation and maybe finding ways forward?
Well, it really underscores the need for early, sustained investment in those disadvantaged areas: schools, transport, healthcare, and, crucially, much stronger, proactive anti-discrimination measures, especially in jobs and policing. Just relying on assimilation clearly wasn't enough in France.
So tackling the structural inequalities and the bias head on.
Exactly. And perhaps fostering a more open conversation about diversity within the Republic, acknowledging contributions, acknowledging the lived reality of discrimination, and really boosting political participation for descendants of immigrants. Maybe a less rigid assimilationist stance earlier on would have helped.
And lessons for Austria, looking at France's
And
struggles.
continue working on education and job market integration for their Turkish origin youth. Maybe reconsider the citizenship laws for those born in the country to foster inclusion. And stay vigilant about addressing any signs of parallel societies or discrimination through dialogue and engagement.
So wrapping up this deep dive, it's clear that France and Austria took different paths, shaped by their unique histories, colonial versus guest worker.
Right, and their policy choices differed significantly too. Citizenship, secularism, urban planning.
Yet both, in their own ways, are still grappling with how to ensure the third generation feels fully included and has genuinely equal opportunities.
Absolutely, the core challenge remains moving beyond marginalization and discrimination so that everyone born there truly belongs. France's experience, particularly the gap between the Republican ideal of equality and the lived reality in the Benelux, serves as a powerful, complex case study.
And here's a final thought for you, the learner, to take away. Thinking about these two countries, their histories, their policies, what do you think are the non-negotiables, the essential ingredients for building truly inclusive societies today, especially with migration and diversity shaping so many nations? And how does national identity itself need to evolve in that process?
It's a huge question, definitely something to mull over. Integration isn't a short-term project, it's an ongoing process for any society.